Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Jaya Gunanika, Mayako Sati, Gunanika, Jaya Gomadi Sati, Gunanika, Mayako Sati, Gunanika, Jaya Mayako Sati, Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. by his grace flung across the ocean of material suffering, and obtain mercy for Krishna. My only wish is to have my consciousness purified by the words emanating from the source's heart. Captured in his lotus feet of perfection and fulfills all his desires. He opens my dark eyes and fills my heart with transcendental knowledge. He is my love, birth after birth, and from him ecstatic pain emanates, my heavy ignorance is destroyed. The vague scripture sings Saranja. Our spiritual master is ocean of mercy, friend of the poor and loving master of devotees. O master, be blessed and blessed. Give us the shade of your lotus feet. Your hands spread for us through your lotus. Keep us shelter of your lotus feet. Please make us worthy of your mercy, so that the Scottish action may flourish in numbers of happy devotees. In the blessings of the action daily, and especially love for you and your devotees.
This is on just now, is it? Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jamuna Tira Vanachari Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Jaya Gopi Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatiravanachari Yamunatiravanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabihari Strong Guru Ki, Shri Prabhupada Ki, Shri Kodi Taima Prashanshi Ki, Kantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki, Nitai Gaur Premanande. Reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 6, Uniting Two Worlds, Shri Kodi Taima Prashanshi Ki. So this is between 1975 and 1977. Please distribute books is the title of this chapter. In October of 1974, Srila Prabhupada wrote to Hamsadutta, his GBC's secretary for Germany, "Whenever there is any publication in any language, it enlivens me 100 times." Although Srila Prabhupada's order from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was to preach and publish in the English language, he had expanded that order to include all the languages and countries of the world. "My first concern is that my book shall be published and distributed profusely all over the world," Srila Prabhupada had written to one of the first devotees in Europe in 1972. Prabhupada wrote always in English, but ever since 1968, when ISKCON had first begun spreading to other countries, he had been talking of printing his books in foreign languages. When in 1972 a German edition of Bhagavad Gita had been printed, Srila Prabhupada had written Hamsadutta, "You have done the right thing by printing Bhagavad Gita in German language, and I very much appreciate that you have done this great service." By 1973, Sankirtan parties had been traveling throughout Germany, distributing several hundred copies of Bhagavad Gita a week. Hamsadutta had promised that he would translate one book a month into German, and when, in the fall of 74, Prabhupada heard of 6 recently printed German translations, he replied, "This is very happy news for me. Thank you. Overflood Europe with German books." Srila Prabhupada said that whenever he published a book, he felt that he had conquered an empire. His books were the basis of the spiritual revolution that would eventually change humanity and save it from the pernicious effects of the age of Kali. "Produce voluminously Spanish language literature," Srila Prabhupada requested. When Hridayananda Goswami had become the zonal leader for South America, Srila Prabhupada had instructed him to emphasize printing and distributing books above opening temples. "I also was printing even before I had big temples in the US," Prabhupada had written. "So you may follow the footsteps of the previous acharyas." It's amazing that not only did Srila Prabhupada fulfill the order of his spiritual master, which was to preach in the English-speaking countries, but he actually got his books in all the different languages. Actually, when Prabhupada received the first copy of Bhagavad Gita in Arabic, and the Prabhupada was so moved, he says, "I take the dust of whoever did this, I take their dust of their feet on my head." It was actually Tribhuvanath who put that together. Srila Prabhupada ki, Transcendental Book Distribution ki. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 4, entitled The Characteristics of Rishabdev. Text 8. Ataha Bhagavan Rishabhadeva Swavarsham Karmakshetram Hanumanyamana Pradarshita Gurukula Vaso Labda Varar Gurubir Anugyato Grihamedinam Dharman Anushikshamano Jayantyam Indra Dattayam Ubaya Lakshanam Karma Samanayamanatam Abhiyunjan Atmajanam Atmasamananam Shata Janayam Asha. Please repeat Ata. Thereupon, after the departure of his father, Ha, indeed, Bhagavan, Supreme Personality of Godhead, Rishabhadeva, Rishabdev, Swa, his own, Varsham, kingdom, Karma, Kshetram, the field of activities, Hanumanyamanana, accepting as Pradarshita, shown as an example, Gurukula Vasha, lived at the Gurukul, Labda, having achieved, Varai, gifts, Gurubi, by the spiritual masters, Anugyata, being ordered, Griha Medinam, of the householders, Dharman, duties, Anushikshamana, teaching by example, Jayantyam, and his wife, Jayanti, Indra Dattayam, offered by Lord Indra, Ubaya Lakshanam, of both types, karma, activities, Samanayam Manatam, mentioned in the scriptures, Abhiyunjan, performing, Atmajanam, sons, Atmasamananam, exactly like himself, Shatam, 100, Janayam Asa, begot. Translation. After Nabi Maharaj departed for Badrikashram, the Supreme Lord Rishabdev understood that his kingdom was his field of activities. He therefore showed himself as an example and taught the duties of a householder by first accepting brahmacharya under the direction of spiritual masters. He also went to live at the spiritual master's place, Gurukula. After his education was finished, he gave gifts, Guru Dakshina, to his spiritual masters and then accepted the life of a householder. He took a wife named Jayanti and begot 100 sons who were as powerful and qualified as he himself. His wife Jayanti had been offered to him by Indra, the king of heaven. Rishabdev and Jayanti performed householder life in an exemplary way, carrying out ritualistic activities ordained by the Shruti and Smriti Shastra. Please repeat. After Nabi Maharaj departed for Badrikashram, the Supreme Lord Rishabdev understood that his kingdom was his field of activities. He therefore showed himself as an example and taught the duties of a householder by first accepting brahmacharya under the direction of spiritual masters. He also went to live at the spiritual master's place, Gurukul. After his education was finished, he gave gifts, Guru Dakshin, to his spiritual masters and then accepted the life of a householder. He took a wife named Jayanti and begot 100 sons who were as powerful and qualified as he himself. His wife Jayanti had been offered to him by Indra, the king of heaven. Rishabdev and Jayanti performed householder life in an exemplary way, carrying out ritualistic activities ordained by the Shruti and Smriti Shastra. Srila Prabhupada's purport. Being an incarnation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Rishabdev had nothing to do with material affairs. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, Patranaya Sadhunam Vinashaya Chaduskritam, the purpose of an incarnation is to liberate his devotees and to stop the demoniac activities of non-devotees. These are the two functions of the Supreme Lord when he incarnates. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has said that in order to preach, one must live a practical life and show people how to do things. Apani, Achari, Bhakti, Sikhaimu, Sabari. One cannot teach others unless he behaves the same way himself. Rishabdev was an ideal king, and he took his education in Gurukul, although he was already educated because the Supreme Lord is omniscient. Although Rishabdev had nothing to learn from Gurukul, he went there just to teach the people in general how to take an education from the right source, from Vedic teachers. He then entered householder life and lived according to the teachers. He went there just to teach people in general how to take an education from the right source, from Vedic teachers. He then entered householder life and lived according to the principles of Vedic knowledge, Shruti and Smriti. And back to Rasamrita Sindhu, Srila Bhagavata, quoting the Skanda Parama states, Shruti Smriti Purana Adi Pancharatra Vidim Vina Aikantiki Harir Bhaktir Utpatayaiva Kalpate. Human society must follow the instructions received from Shruti and Smriti, Vedic literature. Practically applied in life, this is worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead according to the Pancharatrika Vidi. Every human being must advance his spiritual life and at the end return home back to Godhead. Maharaj Rishabdev strictly followed all these principles. He remained an ideal grihasta and taught his sons how to become perfect in spiritual life. These are some examples of how he ruled the earth and completed his mission as an incarnation. Om Ganatamarandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitamena Tasma Shri Gurave Namaha Makam Karoti Vachalam Pangam Lagate Garam Yatkripatamam Vande Shri Gurum Dinataranam Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasati Gaur Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Translation again. After Nabi Maharaj departed for Badri Kashram, the Supreme Lord Rishabdev understood that his kingdom was his field of activities. He therefore showed himself as an example and taught the duties of a householder by first accepting brahmacharya under the direction of spiritual masters. He also went to live at the spiritual master's place, Gurukul. After his education was finished, he gave gifts, Guru Dakshina, to his spiritual masters and then accepted the life of a householder. He took a wife named Jayanti and begot 100 sons who were as powerful and qualified as he himself. His wife Jayanti had been offered to him by Indra, the king of heaven. Rishabdev and Jayanti performed householder life in an exemplary way, carrying out ritualistic activities ordained by the Shruti and Smriti Shastra. So this word here, Anu Shikshamana, teaching by example. So the word Anu, can anyone tell me what Anu means? There's a couple of different meanings of this word. Can anyone say what Anu means? A-N-U? Like you've heard the term Rupanuga. So sometimes Anu can mean to follow, like anumana, different process of acquiring knowledge. There's direct sense perception, which is called, anybody? No, pratyaksha is the Sanskrit name. And the next one is anumana, which means inductive, yeah. That's the other one, which means through speculation, etc. And then there's a shabda brahman, is to hear the transcendental sound vibration. So of these, the most perfect way is to hear the transcendental sound vibration, because with imperfect senses we cannot achieve perfect knowledge, and by following the mind, the information we get through the imperfect senses cannot become perfect. So to get higher knowledge, we have to accept it from a higher source, that which is not imperfect, or that which is perfect. So this word here, anumanya, anushikshimana, teaching by example, means that we follow example and we teach by example. And this was Prabhupada's claim, that his only qualification is that he didn't change anything. And this is such an important qualification. If Prabhupada was to say there's one qualification he had, that he didn't change anything, then we don't think, oh, well, it must be something minor. If that's his only qualification, it's the most important thing. We don't change something. So when the spiritual master, he shows by his personal example how we should behave in the temple, and he shows us the Shastra how we should associate with devotees, how we should practice our devotional service, the different guidelines which are there to help us advance, the do's and don'ts. So just like here in the beginning of the purport, Srila Prabhupada said, or was it in the verse? Yeah. Human society must follow the instructions received from Shruti and Smriti Vedic literature. Now, people could argue, they could say, we must not follow anything if we don't want to. But we're talking from perspective that if one wants to utilize the human form of life for which it is intended, which is for self-realization, tato brahma jigyasa, we have this human form of life, which is different from all the other species, in that we can inquire, who am I? Why am I here? Why am I suffering in this world? And how can I be benefited? What is my supreme benefit? So this question was asked by Sanatana Goswami to Lord Chaitanya, and he replied, Jivera Swarupahoy, Krishnera Nitya Das, Krishnera Tatasta Shakti Beda Beda Prakash. That Jivera Swarupahoy, that the Jiva, the living entity, their constitutional position, their Swarup, is Krishnera Nitya Das, eternal servant of Krishna. So in the material world, we try to be the master, we try to be the Lord, but we're having to serve so many different people which we don't want to serve. We have to serve the council by paying council tax. We have to serve our, the company we work for by showing up at work on time every day. Bad attendance or bad timekeeping is not tolerated in the workplace. Anyone who's worked in the material world knows that you have to be on time, or you don't get paid, or you might lose your job. In some places you actually clock in and they count the minutes. If you're a minute late, you lose an hour. These things, I've personally experienced. And so the material world out there, it's not really, nobody's doing anyone any real favours, unless someone has some compassion, and that is material compassion. So human form of life is meant for simply self-realization is not meant to, it's not meant for the purpose of just eating, sleeping, mating, defending, just like the animals. So we don't find the animals inquiring, they're simply following their senses. They made their choice in the previous life, and then they're given a body which is suitable to their desires. So therefore, if one likes to sleep a lot, they can get the body of a bear or a sloth. If one wants to mate a lot, they can get the body of a pigeon. If they want to eat indiscriminately, they can get the body of a pig. It's all these different things. The modes of material nature will provide what we want. But it's like that old saying in Buddhism, be careful what you want because you might get it. So we want to make an informed decision. We base our life on, if we base our life on simply what the senses want, then we don't have any freedom. Sometimes we think, I want to be free just to enjoy myself. But what kind of freedom is that? You're chained to the senses. Where does that end? For some people, it ends up in addictions, and it generally becomes some kind of degrading thing. Then some people say, well, all things in moderation, but some people can't do that. And even if so, why have some things at all? If it's simply a distraction from what our real purpose of life. So therefore, when it's mentioned here in the purport that human society must follow the instructions received from Shruti and Smriti, then this is pertaining to getting out of this material world. So we're not going to get out of this material world if we're servant of our senses, but if we learn how to be devotee of Krishna, servant of Krishna, then we can get out of this material world. That's what it's meant for. We have to serve anyway. We've got to serve our senses, we've got to serve our boss, we've got to serve so many situations. Sometimes people are so lazy they don't want to even go and sign on the dole. It's like, it's a full-time job to go and sign on once a week. It's like, why do I have to go and do that? Why can't they just give it without me having to get up off my backside and go and sign on the dole? Sometimes become so lazy in this. Sometimes people criticize this welfare system that takes away the vitality of people. In India, you see that people find some kind of way of making a living. Remember when I was in Nepal, there's one old lady, she was collecting dry leaves, and she was basically selling big bags of dried leaves so people could use them for stuffing mattresses and things like that. So they'll find a way. In South Africa also, I noticed that some poor people, they were simply taking fruit off of the fruit trees. The government had planted fruit trees, and this is a typical kind of Vedic thing. Digging wells and planting fruit trees. This is, I'm not saying that we give up the social security system, which is actually, it's a very good system in many ways, unless it's exploited, of course. But naturally, social security there is offered in different ways. In the Vedic system, many food and water would be provided, and employment was provided for everyone. Everyone had a place. But mechanization, then the job of 100 persons becomes a job of 1 or 2 people. 1 man to work a machine and 1 man to fix it. So in the 50s and 60s, when they were promoting mechanization in a big way, then they were painting a picture, literally painting a picture of the utopian situation where people would have so much free time in their hands, and it showed you pictures of people, families picnicking in the park, and it looked so attractive. But what did they get? They got changed up. They got unemployment. And then because of unemployment, alcoholism, drug addiction, prostitution, overcrowded housing situations. So we can't necessarily believe what materialists are putting forward. Srila Prabhupada says that you cannot trust a person who cannot control their senses. So therefore, we see the glories of these great devotees like Maharaj Rishabdev. He realized that his entire kingdom was his field of activity. So that was his field of activity. And if we take the same mentality, maybe our field of activity is some other small field of activity, but we realize this is my domain and where I can serve Krishna, whether we live in a council flat or we live in a temple, we live in our own house. We try to find ways where we can serve Krishna. That becomes our field of activity, and that we can offer to Krishna. And this serving Krishna begins with, how does it begin? Anybody? Hearing. And next. Chanting. Shravanam, Kirtanam, hearing, chanting. And even more specifically, it begins with controlling the tongue. And Prabhupada says, controlling the tongue, for that we have two things. We have chanting and prasad. Almost nobody got the answer there. And it's the fact that Krishna prasadam is non-different from Krishna. When we offer something to Krishna, it becomes Krishna. Therefore, we honor prasad. We don't just see it as grub or scran or nosh. Seeing one devotee, he was referring to prasadam in such a kind of irreverent way, but he continued like that, and he didn't end up to be I don't think he's practicing. So we have to be careful of these things, because don't take it for granted that it's just food or start complaining about it. Even if we take the most palatable dish in the material world and it's not offered to Krishna, then someone who's actually a devotee would rather eat burnt rice, which is offered to Krishna. Of course, if it's burnt, we wouldn't be offering it. Krishna doesn't accept burnt offerings. It should be cooked nicely. There was an instance actually at Bhaktivedanta Manor when Srila Prabhupada was staying there once, that the devotees had offered some sweet rice, and when they came to, the offering was put on, and when the devotee left the altar, then he heard a clatter, and the sweet rice was actually it was just kind of knocked all over the place as if somebody had thrown it. And they reported to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, was it burnt? And they said, yes, actually it was burnt. And he says, well, Krishna's rejected it. He says, but it was made with devotion. He said, if it was made with devotion, it wouldn't be burnt. So we have to be practical. We can't just be sentimental. It's not like we just do any old thing and call it devotion. That's a lazy cop-out. That's a Kali Yuga cop-out of devotion. If we want to do something, we should do it nicely. And we do it nicely for Krishna. We're not just doing it nicely so that we can become like, I'm the best cook in Srimad, or I'm the best kirtan leader or something. We're trying to do it nicely for the pleasure of the deities, the pleasure of the devotees. But if it becomes for ourselves, then we're not actually practicing spiritual life properly. We're feeding our false ego again. So this is typically a trap in the material world, which can happen whether you're living in the temple, outside the temple. False ego comes with you. It's not that you walk into the perimeter of Krunabhavan estate and suddenly your false ego has been checked at the door. You put it there for whenever you decide if you're going to leave or not. And we take it with us, and we have to work on identifying what is our real ego. If someone says, oh, Prabhu, that wasn't very nice how you did that service, you shouldn't think, take it or leave it. That kind of mentality. That may manifest in so many different words, but with that type of mentality, we don't make progress very well. So if someone takes the trouble to teach us, and even if it doesn't come out so nicely, we think, okay, let's just think, okay, maybe the instruction could have been nicer, but sometimes it doesn't matter how nice it is. The person who's given the instruction has perhaps experienced, we all sometimes experience that you try to tell someone something which you think is going to help them, and they don't take it no matter how you couch it. So it's up to each and every individual one of us to want to advance in spiritual life, and that means that we want to hear, how can I make advancement? What could I do which would help me make advancement? If we're thinking like that, Krishna will show us in so many ways, and then it's not so painful. It's just like if you have to go to the dentist and your mind's making a big issue. Oh, I don't want to go, but it's so painful, I have to go. And then the trauma of just getting there, is one thing. But if you just think, I don't really want to go, but I need to go, so I'm just going to go and get it done, then it's not such a big trauma and it's over quickly. So, and Prabhupada said that 50% of all suffering is in the mind. I remember once when I was young, I used to kind of like get cuts and scrapes every other day, probably like most kids. And my knees were constantly getting plastered and bandaged in what they call a poultice, which is where you get bread and you steep it in hot water with sugar or something, then you put it in a bandage and it draws the poison out. And I was forever getting bandaged up. I think it was just my kind of adventurous nature. So anyway, one time I bust my knee up quite bad and I was crying, and then my mother distracted me somehow or another. And then I looked around and I seen the blood coming out of the leg, and then I started crying again. She says, "Oh, did you forget you were crying?" So to me, I look back and I think, yeah, it was in the mind. Actually, I'd forgotten about it. It wasn't actually that painful, or otherwise I'd have been crying. No amount of distraction would have worked. But it was in the mind, so I'm thinking, oh no, I'm bleeding, so I better start crying again. And this is not to say that people aren't suffering greatly. It's not to minimize any suffering which is going on. But our state of mind can certainly help in that respect. A nice example would be Mother Ratnaranjini, a disciple of Srila Prabhupada who used to live here. She suffered for 2 years with a brain tumour, and one of the girls who was helping to look after her had a cold once, and Mother Ranjini, although she was suffering from a brain tumour and her head was swollen, sometimes so bad that her eyes started bleeding, and she wouldn't take many painkillers. Her attitude was that I just want to suffer a lot and get out of this material world. I don't want to avoid what is due me. So very sincere person. Not everyone can do that. But not only was she wanting to accept her lot and just suffer it and get out of the material world, but when she'd seen someone suffering even to a much lesser degree, a common cold, then she was concerned, oh, are you okay? Are you feeling better now? So such compassion, it brings tears to a glass eye. So she passed away in such amazing circumstances, continually chanting while having Govardhan in her hand. And actually Vrinda lives in the room where she passed away and went back to Godhead in. We have no doubt about it. Tribhuvanath, when he came to visit shortly before Mother Anjani passed away, he went to visit her because they were devotee friends from back in the early 70s in Edinburgh Temple in Bury Place and that. And so he went to visit Mother Anjani, came out of the room and he said to the devotees that he only ever once experienced an atmosphere like that. He says the atmosphere was just totally spiritually surcharged. He says he only ever once experienced it, and it was in the room when just before Prabhupada passed away. So we didn't have any doubt about what our destination was, but that's another story for another time. But this verse here is saying that basically the human form of life is to whatever, if we get trained up properly, so we have to subject ourselves, and by subjecting ourselves doesn't mean to say it's like an ordeal or a torture or something like that. The more willing, it's a willing process, so the more willing we are to engage in the process, then the more it'll actually become relisable. Sometimes this becomes a bit of a dilemma, that's a willing process, but we may not be so willing sometimes, and therefore someone else is trying to coerce us or coax us or encourage us in some way to engaging this willing process. So the more willing we become, then the less difficulty it is. But sometimes this unwillingness, we can see it's simply because we're afraid to let go of our false ego. We're afraid to let go of who we are, what we've found to be a source of shelter or security in this material world. But the fact that we've had to take birth many times and die many times is testament to the fact that this false ego hasn't given us security. It hasn't given us shelter. Srila Prabhupada refers to this as taking shelter of the tail of the dog. So say you happen to be in a shipwreck and you're swimming in the ocean and you see a dog swimming, so you're tired and you're struggling, and you see the dog swimming very well, you think, grab onto the tail of the dog. But what happens is the dog will turn around and bite you. So this is what happens when you take shelter in the material world. It's called taking shelter of the tail of the dog. We take shelter in something which is going to turn around and bite us. So therefore, if we scrutinizingly study these books, Prabhupada didn't want us to accept blindly, scrutinizingly study them, and that way we become convinced, and then we can convince other people too. When you're convinced about something and you feel you've really got the benefit from this, and like Prabhupada said, this Srimad Bhagavatam, there is no comparison, there's no competition. You don't even have to worry about anything coming up to compete with this, because there's nowhere where such transcendental knowledge is explained in such abundance, and so many examples. So every step of the way is covered here in Srimad Bhagavatam. And if we take these lessons of the Srimad Bhagavatam, then when we finally get to the 10th canto, then we can actually enter into these pastimes. Prior to that, we may read the 10th canto of the Krishna book and we might catch a glimpse like, oh, this amazing place, the spiritual world, I wish I could go there. And if we want to qualify there, then we take these examples of the previous cantos, the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, and the previous 9 cantos, and we practice these lessons, and then we'll be able to enter into the pastimes of the Lord. Actually, just now we're in the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya. We're not removed from Lord Chaitanya's Leela. This ISKCON is directly a part of Lord Chaitanya's pastimes. He said that this Sankirtan movement, the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, would be spread to every town and village of the world. So by taking part in this, you're taking part in Lord Chaitanya's pastimes. We're not separated by 500 years. It's not a historical movement, it's a dynamic movement. So to be part of that dynamic movement means to apply yourself to it. It's not simply to be a scholar. It's not to learn just some ritualistic performances, but actually it's to imbibe these lessons, put them into our life, and change our heart. So first time I read Bhagavad Gita, I was living at home with my parents, and at this time, I think I hadn't met devotees. I got the Bhagavad Gita from my brother-in-law, and I came to the 16th chapter, which is called Divine and Demoniac Natures. So first of all, we hear the description of what? Divine natures, that's right. So I was reading that and thinking, oh yes, these things, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think I could relate to being one of the divine persons. And then next verses, it's the demoniac natures, and I realised, actually, those are the ones I'd like to be, but these are actually the ones I am. And I realised I had some work to do. Somehow or another, I have to go from this demonic nature to the divine nature. Pride, arrogance, conceit, false ego, all these different things were there, still there. But by the grace of the spiritual master and by the grace of Krishna, then we get, and the devotees, then we get exposed to the purification. Just like if you expose sometimes in the process of drying fruit or vegetables, then you expose the vegetables to the sun. You put maybe in a glass arrangement, so it magnifies the sun, and then it dries out, and then you can store it. It's anything there which is going to create any kind of deterioration, then that is so that it's safe to store. So similarly, we expose ourselves to the light of Krishna consciousness, and then we become purified. So Krishna is known as Pavitram, or pure. And when we associate with Krishna through hearing and chanting, through taking prasad, in so many different ways, through service, etc., then we become purified. So Krishna consciousness is not a fashion, it's not a change of dress or a change of hairstyle, it's not a pose, it's not some form of escapism. It is actually, in one sense, escapism, escaping from the material world. But in order to do that, we have to practice it properly. We can't fake it. We have to have that change of heart. And so the change of heart means to recognize, part of self-realization is to recognize what these divine qualities are, and to see, honestly have a look at ourselves and think, yeah, I certainly could improve on these things. Now, we don't want to be too down on ourselves. If you're too much introspection, then that can cause you to come to a halt when you think, oh, I'll never make it, it's too big a hill to climb, etc. But every hill is climbed, every mountain is conquered by one step at a time. We don't have to do it all in one day. You know, if someone's got the capability to do it at a certain rate, that's fine, that's up to them. But it's an individual journey, so we have to be concerned with what our steps are. But even if someone instructs us in something, we think, well, you can talk, take the log out your own eye before you take the splinter out of mine. We can do like that if we want, and we can maybe justify it, but is the splinter in our eye? Are we going to get benefited by taking the splinter out of our eye? So that's what we should be concerned about. It doesn't matter if the person who told us has got 10 things wrong with them. If we've got one thing wrong with them, we should think, well, that's great. Someone told me what my next step is. Krishna has spoken through this person, how I can improve on my devotional service, how I can improve in my Krishna consciousness. So sometimes it's hard for us to accept instruction. It's natural that we just want to defend ourselves because we've already got all our reasonings in place as to why we behave the way we behave, why we think the way we think. And some of those reasonings sound very logical, reasonable, etc. But Krishna is beyond logic. It's not that he's not logical, but he's logical and beyond logic. So in this way, we can never force Krishna to appear before us simply out of some kind of logical argument, or no matter how much we do, and still we can't force Krishna to come before us, but only when we realize that we're dependent on Krishna's mercy, then Krishna will come. Krishna is attracted by the devotee's endeavours. Even if we're struggling, we might think, oh, I'm such a poor example of a devotee, how can I set a good example to anybody? Then that is the beginning of humility, to think like that. That's a good example. It's interesting that the most advanced devotees are always in bliss, but they're not thinking that they're great. They're not thinking, I'm better than everybody, I'm self-realized, I'm champion here. They're not thinking like that. They're thinking, I'm fool number one. I'm such a fool, how could I forget Krishna and come to this material world? And because of that remorse, then they're becoming reinstated. So there's something called the 4 R's. And this is often used in conflict resolution, etc. And does anybody know these 4 R's?
Remorse, rectification.
So before remorse, recognition. And last one.
Rectification.
No, that's the road to reinstatement. Yeah. So first of all, there's recognition. So just like in Christianity, they say repent for your sins. So the recognition that Yeah, I did things that would actually were harmful to other living entities, harmful to myself. Recognize that. That's part of self-realization. And then remorse is like, I was such a fool for doing that. I'm sorry that, I harmed some insects when I was young, or some small animals. It's not unusual that children do these things, and we look back and we think, oh, it was terrible of me to do that, or we did some harm to some other person, cheated someone, or whatever we did, who were hard to somebody. So we can be remorseful of that, and then we think, okay, what can I do? Because lip service isn't enough, we have to do something. Prabhupada says that devotion means we have to demonstrate. It's not a feeling, it's an act. It's an act of devotion. It means that we demonstrate. We may feel like devotion, but we demonstrate those feelings through an act. So therefore, it's not enough simply to say, I feel very devotional today. What does that mean? How do we express that? We express it through doing devotional service. So this recognition, remorse, and path of rectification. So the path of rectification is a path which is given to us, therefore, this dharma is there, which means that we're given some kind of instruction how we can live our life in such a way as that we can be benefited and become free from the attachment to material life. And so this leads to reinstatement. So we don't get back to being reinstated to Krishna, with Krishna, in eternal bliss and knowledge. We don't get back to there without the recognition, remorse, and rectification. So the path of sadhana bhakti is a path of rectification. So when we read these books, first of all, we begin to realize, there is something higher in life, and I've been foolish, I've been involved in eating meat, intoxication, illicit sex, gambling, all the different things which are simply a cause of entanglement, future suffering for ourselves, causing suffering to other living entities. So when we recognize this and we show the path of rectification, means okay, the four pillars of religion are the four Brahminical principles. Can anyone name one of them? What? Truthfulness. Okay, so if we're truthful, then what does that defeat? Yeah. So out of the four sinful activities, these four Brahminical principles actually correlate. So if we're truthful, then what does that defeat? Gambling. Yeah, because in gambling there's cheating, isn't there? Untruth. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, of gambling I am the cheat. So the one who's always winning, he's the cheat, he's the smart guy. Okay, what else? We've got another religious principle. Truthfulness. Cleanliness. Exactly, yeah. So cleanliness, so this refers to, what does that relate to? Which of the sinful activities? Illicit sex, yeah, it's considered unclean. And then, so that's two. We've got two more. Austerity. Okay, yeah, so austerity, so that defeats what? Intoxication. Funnily enough, when people are intoxicated, sometimes they'll do some things, at least in Scotland anyway, they'll do some things they wouldn't do, like sleeping outside in a cold night. But that's because they're so oblivious. But generally it means that they're very lazy. Someone who's intoxicated is very lazy, isn't it? They don't want to perform austerities. So austerity may mean that they go and get a good education, or they go and get a proper job, or work hard, but rather they just get intoxicated and not want to face up to the troubles of life. And then the last one, last Brahminical principle, mercy, yeah. So truthfulness, cleanliness, austerity, and mercy. These are the four Brahminical principles. So this principle of mercy, how do we demonstrate that? by not eating animals which have been slaughtered. Yeah. So we can't consider ourselves merciful if we're feeding off of dead animals. We're not merciful to them. So Prabhupada, actually, if you read the Higher Taste, Prabhupada is quoted in there. I can't remember where the quote is from, but he said that this, if we want peace in the world, then that peace cannot be limited only to the human society. It must include animal society. It must include all living beings. He says, otherwise there's no possibility of peace. And he also says, this philosophy of love thy neighbour but kill the animals, this is Satan's philosophy. This is not God's philosophy. So therefore it's really important, if we want Krishna, if we want God to be merciful to us, then we have to be merciful to other living entities. And then very quickly, Krishna will realize, he'll recognize that we're making an endeavor. And so by taking to this process of sadhana bhakti, in the beginning there are definitely challenges there because we're still accustomed to our old habits, we're accustomed to our old ways of thinking and naturally taking shelter in the tail of the dog, taking shelter in the material world. But we have to gradually start to open ourselves up to the possibility that eternal life is waiting for us simply by, and we can experience it here and now. We don't have to behave in such a way like a goody two-shoes and hope that we tip the scales of justice at the end of our life. We can actually start to taste the immortality even in this life through chanting, japa, through kirtan, realizations through reading, through service. So in this way, actually, our life here, in this human form of life, here and now, the present life we have, becomes liberated. So as we've heard this saying, being in the world but not of the world, that means that we're no longer bound by karma. Karma bandhana, it's funny that the word bandhana means bondage, to be bound. So bound by our activities, the only thing that binds us to this material world is ourselves. And there's no one else responsible for us being here. There's no one else responsible for us staying here. And we are also the person who's responsible to get out of here. And it's perfectly possible. Everything's given to us for that purpose. And simply it just requires that we apply this and try to increase. So we can pray to the deities, we can pray to the spiritual master that we become more open-hearted, more open-minded, so that we can receive this transcendental knowledge, Divya Gyan Hridi Prakashito, just like we say, this Divya Gyan, divine knowledge, is coming from the spiritual master. Chaku Dan Dilu Janmi Janmi Prabhu say, our eyes are being opened, or chaku, or chakshus, or sight. That Dan is a gift, just like Dhananjaya, or the word Dan means donation. It's been given to us. And the spiritual master, life after life, he's trying to impart this transcendental knowledge into our heart. Divya Gyan Hridi Prakashito. So into our heart, he's trying to inject it into us. Prema Bhakti Yaha Hoiti Avidya Vinashayati. So he's giving us this gift of pure love of Krishna and trying to destroy our ignorance with the knowledge coming from the Vedic literatures. And he is personally exemplifying these characteristics of the pure devotee. So when we're singing this every day, we should try to imbibe the meaning of it and remember it throughout our daily life, and it will become so much enriched, and then it will come to the point where we're actually eager. So we'll just finish with one last thing, as we've heard it many times, is Advaita Acharya, because he was senior by birth to Lord Chaitanya in the social sense, then Lord Chaitanya would never chastise him. He'd never tell him off. And so Advaita Acharya was thinking, no, Lord Chaitanya doesn't love me. He tells everyone else off, but he doesn't tell me. So he decided to become a rascal. He started preaching Mayavadi philosophy. He started preaching nonsense philosophy. And then Lord Chaitanya came and chastised him. And then he was in ecstasy. He was thinking, Now I know that Lord Chaitanya loves me. So if someone loves you, they'll tell you, oh, don't do that, you know, you're going to hurt yourself. If someone just thinks, oh, it's a stranger, it's nothing to do with me, I don't care what happens to the person, sometimes they don't even get that far as thinking about it, they just don't interest themselves. So it can be a sign of love. And even if we think it's not coming from the best place, if it's going to help us, then we can take it. That's up to us. We've got that choice we can make or not. Okay, we'll just stop there. Anyone got any questions or comments? Okay, at the same time, just to temper that last statement, at the same time, if we're giving instruction to someone, we shouldn't just think, well, it's up to you to be sincere, I'm just going to give you any old way. We shouldn't be like that and think that I don't have to be careful about how I instruct. It's up to someone else to be sincere. No, it's two ways. We should be careful about how we instruct, and we should be eager to receive instruction. So this is what we're aiming for. We have to keep on practicing that until we become so expert at it that people were happy to hear from us, and we're happy to hear the instructions as well. Iskon Guruvinda ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Nitai Gaur Premanande. Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki.